Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett, and thank you for joining me for a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Today, as you may have guessed, I'm going to be talking about humanoids. I love humanoid cases. I think they represent the cutting edge of UFO research, so much to teach us about who we are and what's out there in the universe. I call today's episode 10 Truly Bizarre Humanoid Encounters. I think what we're dealing with in all of these cases, and in most cases of humanoids, are extraterrestrials. I know there's all kinds of theories out there, but that's certainly my assessment. And the 10 cases I've brought to you today cover quite a wide period of time, all the way from 1930 up to 1997. And I love digging up those more obscure cases from all over the world. Pretty sure you haven't heard of most of these cases, but we'll see. Cases I brought to you today come from Poland, Spain, Croatia, Estonia, Australia, as well as Brazil, and 4 cases from the United States, including California, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Texas. These cases do involve a wide variety of humanoids. Greys, of course. Greys are pretty prominent in the UFO field. But human-looking ETs, short humanoids, some really unusual described humanoids I don't know that I've ever heard before. And yeah, some of these cases have some real high strangeness to them. I hope that one day we don't consider these cases strange or bizarre, but I don't think we're quite there yet. Thankfully, this subject is going mainstream. I think we now have enough evidence to really convince most skeptics, people who are willing to examine the evidence objectively. And the cases I'm bringing you today, some have multiple witnesses, corroborating witnesses. A good number of them have some form of evidence, whether it's animal reactions, some really unusual ones actually, but also physiological effects, landing traces, and so on. So this is going to be a pretty long episode. I'm hoping you find it interesting because, wow, some of these cases are just so unusual. Now, first case I'd like to cover today dates all the way back to 1930. I call this one, "We Can't Let You Through." This is a direct quote from the apparent ETs that this lady from Texas encountered way back in 1930. I like this case because it's a very early case. This lady decided to contact a UFO organization after reading about the Betty and Barney Hill case many years after her encounter. Unfortunately, she contacted the wrong UFO organization, which led to some pretty disappointing consequences, but did result in her encounter being documented, and I'd like to share it with you today because it is very unusual. This case comes from the fall 2003 issue of the International UFO Reporter in an article by researcher, as I said, Michael Swords. The title of the article is "Too Close for Condon: Close Encounters of the Fourth Kind." Now, as you may know, the Condon Committee was an Air Force-funded UFO study in operation from 1966 to 1968 and is well known in the UFO community for its biased, unobjective attitude against the reality of UFOs. It's widely believed to be an attempt by the Air Force to extricate itself from the UFO subject rather than a scientific study. It was widely panned by UFO researchers, and in fact, 1 year later, Project Blue Book, the main Air Force study, was closed down. Most of Condon's material came directly from Blue Book, but they did receive a few reports directly from witnesses, including this one from a Texas woman. They actually ignored the report and declined to investigate it. The woman, I'll call her Margaret, that is a pseudonym, wrote to the Condon Committee in 1968 because she had an experience 38 years earlier that had left her with chronic nervousness and nightmares, she said. She was elderly and suffering from ill health. Her doctor told her that her deteriorating health was being exacerbated by something on her mind that was a source of stress. But Margaret refused to tell her doctor about this encounter. She was afraid her family would think, quote, that I'd lost all my marbles. So instead she wrote to the convent committee seeking help from them, but sadly she got no help from them. But she was able to have her case documented. Her story began around 10 a.m. one morning in 1930 as she drove alone along a road in an isolated hilly area somewhere in Texas, about 15 miles from her home, which was her destination, and this is when she encountered a classic flying saucer by the side of the road and a group of unusual humanoids standing in the middle of the road blocking her way. And she describes her encounter in great detail, and this is what Margaret said. I remember turning a curve in the road and running up to and under the side of a huge thing sitting by the road. I was within a few steps of it, almost under one side of it when I stopped. It was sort of a shiny gunmetal color, round and shaped like two dinner plates face to face, with a dome on the upper top side. It was about 100 feet across, about 15 feet thick. So she saw a door was open on the craft. It had a ramp leading down to the ground with steps on it. This craft had settled on uneven terrain, so the back section of the craft sat on the ground itself, but the front part, where the terrain was lower, sat on two thin landing legs with circular landing pads at the bottom. You can see her drawing. Blocking the road was a group of 8 or 10 child-sized figures and one 6-foot taller figure who appeared to be a man. Margaret's first impression was that she had actually come upon a Boy Scout troop and their scoutmaster. But it wasn't long before things became strange, because she saw that these figures were not only dressed strangely, they looked strange and were acting strange. All of them wore identical tan-colored uniforms, but as Margaret says, I saw that there were no pockets, buttons, edges, wrinkles, or pocket flaps. Very clean, neat, and nice. They wore tight little caps, cut like baseball caps with narrow little bills. Now their appearance was even more strange. She thought for a second that they might be Asian, but soon noticed that no, they were much stranger. As Margaret says, they had very large, slanted eyes, very large cheekbones, and very thin lips. The tall one walked up to her, and as Margaret says, forced me to stop while he talked to me. Or at least I think he talked, although I did not see his lips move, and he turned his face away and looked down. Now, as he spoke to her in what was clearly telepathy, the smaller figures approached behind him, and as Margaret says, they did not look like children, but adults. They smiled at me but did not speak. I had to smile back because they were sort of pushing each other around in horseplay, like each one trying to get in front of the other to see better and acting like kids will. So at this point, the tall man began to argue with her. He told her, "Lady, you'll have to leave the highway and go around as we have the road blocked here." So she ignored this instruction, pointed to the saucer and said, "What is that?" The man evaded her question and said, "Never mind. You'll just have to go around. We want the road left clear and open, and can't let you through here." He pointed to the rocky gully alongside the road and the steep hill leading back up to the road and said, "You are a wonderful driver, and you can make it all right." Now Margaret started to feel some fear, and seeing that the way the man was pointing at was a 40-degree angle down and very rough, she argued with him and told him, "I can't put this big car down through that creek and rocks. It'd tear my car all to pieces, and I could never get out the other side. And besides, you don't own this highway." So once again, events became even stranger. As Margaret says, "Somehow I couldn't help myself, and dazedly drove very slowly and fearfully down into this creek and rough canyon. I realized that the man was walking right along with me. I felt very safe then, and was able to make the crossing, and was no longer afraid. I wonder why." So Margaret doesn't remember what happened next. She seemed to lose consciousness and came back to awareness standing on her home porch. It was now around midnight, so she was missing about 14 hours of time that she could not account for. And as Margaret says, "Where I was, where I went, what happened to me those many hours, I have no idea." She did make some inquiries and learned that her neighbors had actually driven along that road during the period of missing time and saw her car parked on the hillside off the road. They continued driving and informed her family, and when Margaret showed up, her father was just beginning to form a search party to look for her. Now, in her letter to the Condon Committee, Margaret wrote that I was taken aboard this saucer and carried away, God knows where, I haven't a simple doubt. But if this did not happen as I remember it, then what did? I want to know so badly that I'm sick. Something did happen. What? I want to know the truth, the whole truth, regardless of what it was. So Margaret, in her letter, offered to be interviewed and even go under hypnosis. Michael Swords, in a scathing critique of the Condon Committee, writes of this case and the others similar to it that were rejected by them, and I quote, "The project ignored her. Condon filed the letter under the category psychological. The project and Ed Condon couldn't be bothered. This is an old and sickly lady asking for some help. This inaction was a type of sin of omission that reflects badly on Colorado. One must wonder what UFO research might have been like if Colorado had been a serious, open-minded, dare one say scientific, research project. Might we have been able to establish an uncontaminated set of CE4 cases with data gained under the auspices of a sanctioned academic study? This element of the UFO phenomenon might have been established or at least clarified 15 years before it arose from the work of a friendly UFO investigator and artist named Bud Hopkins. Congratulations, Ed Condon, Bob Lowe, David Saunders, and Norm Levine. All of you, as usual, blew it." So these were, of course, the major players in the Condon Committee, but kudos to Dave Saunders. Credit to him because he later wrote a book called UFOs Yes, which stated unequivocally that UFOs are real and the Condon Committee was a disaster. Thanks to Michael Swords for bringing this case to our attention, and shame on the Condon Committee. Here's a lady who's just seeking help about her encounter and they don't help her. This is really, I think, the main purpose for UFO organizations. But as I think we all know now, the Condon Committee was hardly an objective scientific body. Really unfortunate. But what an unusual case. I don't think there's any possible way that this lady would have normally been able to drive her car off the road, like did happen in this case. So something really unusual is going on there. But yeah, some very interesting aspects to this case. She did not jump to the ET explanation right away, thinking this might be a Boy Scout troop with a scoutmaster. I thought it was very interesting the way she described these short little guys as being very playful, almost like children. Actually made her smile, but also a pretty traumatic case for her in some ways with, 14 hours of missing time. Doesn't look like we'll ever find out what happened during those missing 14 hours, because by now, sadly, the witness must most certainly have passed away. But what an interesting case, and definitely worthy of being well known. So now let's move to the next case. This one is also really interesting and unusual. I call this one, It Doesn't Matter, It's a Child. This one occurred way back in 1945 in Lavadores. This is in Vigo, Spain. It's quite an unusual case. It's not that rare for people to see multiple types of entities, and that's what's going on in this case. But as we'll see, the entities in this case are quite unusual. It's also interesting because the witness encountered them in a public place, kind of where you'd least expect to see ETs or apparent ETs. But yeah, it's a brief case, but I think you'll find it really fascinating. The main witness in this case, Julio F., was only 13 years old at the time of his encounter. He lived with his family in the Lavadores area of Vigo, Spain, a largely urban area, and near his house there was this public fountain where people in the neighborhood went to gather fresh water or wash their clothes. This fountain was right next to the street, inside a small enclosure with access through an open entrance, a gate. and in the center there was the small laundry room. It was one of Julio's daily chores to gather water from the fountain each morning. This morning, at his mother's request, Julio grabbed a water bucket and went to go get some water, just as he had done many times before, but this time something happened that had never happened before. Going through the open gate entrance, he was astonished to see two strangely dressed beings standing at the back of the laundry room and talking to each other. In fact, their appearance was so strange, and Julio was so amazed by them, that he immediately dropped the water bucket and stared in astonishment. One of these figures was located in the innermost part of the laundry room. His right arm and hand were extended and was pointing at something. Now this being had very long hair, a thin beard, and was dressed in a long tunic, and Julio's first thought was that this figure looked very much like Jesus Christ. But the other figure looked completely different. This other figure was bald, had large slanted eyes, and looked much like a gray alien. It also wore an ankle-length tunic. So Julio was so amazed by this strange sight that he just froze in place. These two beings immediately noticed Julio's presence, and one of them said to the other, "It doesn't matter, it's just a child." And at that moment they vanished into thin air. Julio did not see them walk out, they just disappeared. Now, seized by fear and panic, he ran straight home, completely forgetting and ignoring his task to bring back water. In fact, he refused to go back until some time had passed, and when he did, the beings were of course gone. Years later, he looked back on this incident as possibly an encounter with religious figures, and says that although it astonished and frightened him, it did not really cause any profound changes in his life, but it was something he remembered for a very long time. He and his family later immigrated to Argentina. So there was no apparent UFO craft in that case, so possibly there is a different explanation, and the witness did kind of take a religious viewpoint towards this encounter. Very hard to say, because it certainly sounds like a typical gray ET. As far as this Jesus-looking figure, I don't know. It's very unusual. You can make up your own minds about it. There is sometimes these mixed motif cases that do have what appear to be religious elements to it, but really unusual, and certainly a fascinating case. And so is this next one, which I call the gesticulating extraterrestrial. This occurred in August 1958 in Paraibo do Sul. This is in Brazil, in a rural area. This is a single witness case, but what a close encounter this gentleman had. Actually saw this craft land, saw this beautiful human-looking male ET come out, and had a really interesting and fairly lengthy interaction with this being. That alone makes this case, I think, super interesting, and hopefully you will find it interesting too. This case comes from longtime Brazilian researcher Dr. Walter K. Buehler, a very respected researcher. The witness is anonymous, though his name is known by Dr. Buehler. For the purposes of this report, I'll just give him the pseudonym Luis. It was one day in August of 1958 that Luis stepped outside his home, located about 30 kilometers from Paraibo do Sul in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and this is when movement in the sky caught his eye. Looking up, he saw a shiny object descending silently and apparently coming towards him. Before he could react, this craft landed a short distance away, close enough that Luis could hear a whining noise coming from it. He could see it was yellow-golden in color, shaped like two bowls placed end to end, and around the circumference where these two pieces were joined together at the rim, he could see small rectangular openings, which now appeared to release a, quote, faint white smoke. Now curious but cautious, Luis walked closer, and getting quite near it, he saw a small round porthole opening on the lower part of the craft. Immediately, the head and shoulders and upper torso of a human-looking male emerged from the porthole, and this UFO occupant looked directly at Luis and smiled at him. Now Luis's first impulse was to turn around and run, but he found that he was so afraid that he was rooted to the spot. This humanoid got out of the craft and walked right up to Luis, who could now see the man clearly. Luis said that this man was about 5 feet 7 inches tall, had long blonde hair, an unblemished pink complexion with no facial hair, and was, as Luis said, good looking. He was dressed in a light-colored jumpsuit with no pockets, no seams, and this man reached down and picked up a stone and seemed to examine it. Now, during this time, he never spoke a word, nor did Luis receive any telepathic messages. Instead, this man began to make a series of gestures and gesticulations in an apparent attempt to communicate with Luis. First, he stretched out his open hand towards Luis, who, not understanding this gesture, just kind of stood there. The man then made a second gesture, pointing forward, apparently trying to communicate something which Luis did not understand. Luis wondered if perhaps the man was referencing the hills and the trees or something else around them in the environment. But with Luis not understanding, the man seemed to react with a movement of disgust or even anger. He turned away from Luis, strode back to the machine, climbed back inside. Shortly afterwards, this craft rose slowly at first, and then after reaching a certain elevation, zipped away at very high speed. Case after case after case. At that time when this encounter occurred, there really weren't a whole lot of humanoid encounters, and the vast majority of researchers actually refused to even investigate humanoid encounters. If it was a sighting, sure, they'll take it seriously, but investigators were very reluctant to deal with anything involving humanoids, which to me is so unbelievable, because clearly something has to be inside these craft, or someone. Certainly that's exactly what we're seeing. Humanoid encounters now, again, I think are considered the cutting edge of UFO research, the front lines, the kinds of cases where we learn the most about who these visitors are. So yeah, an important case. Now, let's move to the next case, which is actually a series of cases that I call the Glinique humanoids. This took place primarily in 1963 in the small Polish town of Glinique in Poland. And yeah, several humanoid encounters in this one, but all types of sightings and landings, really unusual events. There might be something about this town that is drawing all this activity. I don't know. I tend to think that everywhere in the world has a long, rich history of encounters, but definitely this little town in Poland has its fair share. This series of really interesting UFO events comes from Polish researcher Arkadiusz Miazga, and were published in his book UFOs in Subcarpathia, in the Polish language. Now, the earliest incident involves a lady by the name of Sophia L., who says that one summer morning in early 1950s, she was outside her home in the small village of Glinique, about 15 miles south of the much larger city of Ropsice. She was walking outside her home when she saw something she couldn't explain. Standing in front of her, less than 20 feet away in a field, was a strange figure. Now, it was facing the other direction, so she couldn't see its face, only its backside. But it was dressed, she said, in brown clothes and looked like a broad-shouldered man about 175 centimeters tall. But what really surprised her was when this figure took a few steps forward and then seemed to push strongly off the ground and actually rose, levitated into the air. He levitated upwards about 5 or 10 feet and then suddenly just disappeared into thin air. Now, she did not know what to think of it. She just kind of filed it in the back of her mind. But many years later, in the summer of 1963, her 6-year-old son would have an even more remarkable encounter with an unusual UFO. Her son, Tomas, this is a pseudonym, was playing in a clearing near their barn when he suddenly felt, as he put it, quote, out of place. He said goosebumps ran up and down his spine, and he looked around to see if anything unusual was happening, and sure enough, Looking in front of him to the north, he saw a very strange object sitting on the ground about 12 feet away from him. It was not large, about 3 feet wide, 90 centimeters tall, gray in color with darker spots. It was pulsating in brightness, seemed to be trembling slightly, but was completely silent. Now, although Tomas was only 6 years old, he could see that this was something strange he had never encountered before, and he was intrigued, so he slowly approached it, and as he got closer he could feel heat coming from this object. He kept walking towards it and stood right next to it, then placed the palm of his hand directly on it. He said it felt, quote, cold and sticky. Now, the moment he touched it, he became instantly and totally immobilized. He couldn't cry out, he couldn't move, although he wanted to, and as his fear mounted, this object suddenly let him go. Tomas stepped back, and armed with his handkerchief, he threw it at the object with all his might, then turned and ran to get his mother. They both returned to the site and found nothing except Tomas's handkerchief, but Sophia did note that the spot where Tomas had seen this strange object was the exact same spot where she had seen this humanoid about 10 years earlier. And as it turned out, many other strange things were happening in this area. In fact, it was just a few months earlier, that spring, 3 young boys, all around 9 years old, saw a similarly shaped object, 30 centimeters long, 10 centimeters tall, moving about 20 feet above the ground, flying among the trees. The boys were impressed enough to throw sticks at the object to try to hit it. Now, this area has many sightings and, of course, humanoids. In the summer of 1985, at least 2 residents of this town, Glenique, saw what looked like a glowing yellow-pink cross hovering at low elevation between 2 barns. It had a weird wavering appearance, was totally silent, and disappeared after a few seconds. It was just a few months later, one October night in 1985, a young boy who lived in the village came running into his home, telling his family that he saw, quote, something strange outside. Immediately, the room filled with red light, so they and all the other neighbors came running out of their homes and saw this 9 to 10 foot wide red sphere with vertical stripes hovering about 300 feet away, moving over a meadow. It appeared to be slightly transparent because they could see something more solid moving back and forth inside it. It was flying about 60 feet above the ground, then suddenly dissolved in the air, leaving behind a trail of gray-blue smoke. Very strange. And later, in November of 1991, at the house next door, a lady by the name of Christina said that she went to bed and moments later saw the silhouette of a humanoid figure near her bed. At that exact moment, she became totally paralyzed, was quite frightened, and watched this creature glide in a sort of floating fashion towards her bed. She could now feel a strange coldness as it moved by the foot of her bed and presumably disappeared. Now here is one of the more interesting cases in this area, also involving a humanoid. This occurred in 1999 to a gentleman by the name of Jacek. He's a 50-year-old handyman. He was walking through his backyard around 11 p.m. when he noticed a strange glow behind a grove of trees. He approached and saw that the glow was coming from a dark figure surrounded by a glowing aura. It was standing about 90 feet away from him, so he approached to within 10, maybe 20 feet, but he stopped because all the hair on his body started to stand on end. He was close enough to see that this figure was just under 6 feet tall. It appeared to be a thin young man with short hair, but the strangest thing was this strong aura of light surrounding him. But then the man spoke to Jacek, saying, quote, "Come to me." This made Jacek very afraid, and as he says, "Lord, I don't want to go anywhere yet." It was at that moment that this figure rose up into the air, levitating. The wind began to swirl around him. He rose 10 or 20 feet into the air and disappeared. Jacek said he felt very cold, but at the same time broke out in a cold sweat. He had no idea how to explain the appearance and disappearance of this strange figure. A few years later, March 29, 2002, he was carrying buckets of water into his house when he saw a reddish-pink sphere flying about 150 feet above the ground and coming close. It flew directly over his house, lighting up the area as bright as daylight, he said, and then moved off, disappearing behind the house. One final encounter in this area, also involving the humanoid, occurred on May 16, 2009. The witness was Marek. He's a 48-year-old farmer. It was around 4 p.m. that day that he and his neighbor had lit a small campfire to cook some sausages. Marek was sitting on a bench among the trees when he heard a strange echoing sound coming from the nearby barn. This is about 75 feet away. And looking in that direction, he saw a strange, mysterious figure standing completely motionless next to the barn and staring right at him. This figure was about 6 feet tall, appeared to be quite thin and frail, dark in color, and had long black hair. He was wearing a cloak much like priests wear, and then this figure moved behind the barn. So Marek jumped up, chased after it, came around the barn, but this figure was gone, had somehow completely disappeared. There you go. What really drew me to investigate this particular case was the one involving the mother and her son. She having an encounter years before her son did, but in the same place where he encountered this very small craft, actually walked up to it and touched it. So unusual. A really interesting series of events. Thanks to Arkady for investigating these. I wish I could read Polish. I would check out his book in a heartbeat, but super interesting. All right, let's move to the next case. I love this one. It's just really fascinating. Of course, I think all these cases are fascinating, as you can probably guess. But yeah, this one, I don't know. There was just something really unusual about it. I call this one, It Was Beautiful. This occurred on February 15, 1963, at a small farm called Willow Grove. This is located in Moe in Victoria, Australia. This particular encounter got quite a bit of press attention at the time, but wow, does it have some really unusual elements to it. This case, again often called the Willow Grove encounter, comes from one of the first true scientists to look into this subject, atmospheric physicist Dr. James McDonald. It was 7 a.m. one cloudy rainy day on February 15, 1963, as Charles Brew and his son Trevor, age 21, stepped outside their ranch, Willow Grove Farm, in Moe, Victoria, Australia, to milk their cows. They had a herd of about 40 cows, and they were in the milking shed with 10 of the cows, had just started about 10 minutes ago. The 30 other cows were out in the fields, and looking outside a window of the milking shed, this is when Charles noticed a strange craft emerging out of the low-hanging cloud base. He remarked on it to his son and said, "It looks like a flying saucer." And he watched as this craft moved across the sky, slowed down, and descended at a steep angle, and then proceeded to hover about 40 feet directly above a large tree. There were no lights that he could see on this object. It was emitting a whirring sound, which Charles described as much like a bull roar or a didgeridoo. Charles' son Trevor also heard this sound, which he said definitely didn't sound like an engine, but made it sound more like a yardstick sounds when you whir it in the wind, as he said, like a lump of wood being swung around in the breeze. So basically the same sound that Charles heard. Now shortly after this object hovered above the tree, the nearby herd of 30 cows took off running, with 2 groups forming, each fleeing in the opposite directions away from the strange craft. The horses also took off. Charles's 2 farm dogs, who normally followed him everywhere, both took off. And as Charles says, the cows turned somersaults, and the horse reared up in panic. Now Charles was close enough to see this object in pretty good detail. He said it was about 10 feet high, 20 feet across, shaped very much like a child's toy spinning top, though flatter in shape. You can see his drawing here. There was a bottom section which revolved slowly counterclockwise at a rate of 1 revolution per second, slow enough that he could see what looked like small scooped holes on the edges. This seemed to glow a pale blue color, But most amazing was that there was a transparent domed top section, and inside this, Charles could see what appeared to be two humanoid figures, though they were not clearly defined, and he hesitated to talk about them. But Charles said that he felt almost as if he could not look away, and as he said, it was, quote, as though a beam of magnetic current were keeping his gaze fixed on the strange craft. Now his son Trevor rushed to the window to view the object, but before he could see it, this object accelerated away at the same steep angle it had used upon arrival and disappeared back into the cloud cover. The entire duration of the sighting was no more than 15 seconds. But here's something interesting. As soon as it arrived, Charles developed this strange headache, and the longer it stayed, even for just 15 seconds, the stronger this headache became. And this headache lasted for hours and up through the next day. Trevor did not experience this. But another weird after effect, Charles noticed that there was a 10% reduction in milk production from the cows for 1 week after this encounter. Charles did say that his neighbor Len Roswell had seen a UFO 3 years earlier, which he said was shaped like a big long German sausage, and also that his friend Ron Dent had previously seen a flying saucer. This case ended up receiving considerable press attention years after the fact. The military tried to explain it away as a weird electromagnetic effect from perhaps a tornado. Now, while this saucer did cause a headache and reduction in milk production, Charles does not view this encounter as negative. As he says, "I wish it would come again. It was beautiful. I could feel the life pulsating from it." Now here's a really interesting and weird coincidence. Following this sighting, just a month or two later, they found a meteorite, a large one, over a foot wide, weighing some 50 pounds, get this, directly below where the saucer had hovered a few months earlier. How about that? So interesting. And another case that could easily have been lost to posterity if not for Dr. James McDonald interviewing the witness. Really, really amazing. And some of the aspects to this case are just so unusual. I can only imagine what it must be like to see a cow doing a somersault trying to get away from a UFO. So interesting how all the animals on this farm reacted. I'm guessing that they can sense the presence of a UFO in ways that are beyond perhaps our own senses, but also interesting because the primary witness says that he immediately sensed the energy coming from this craft, could not look away, almost as if there was a magnetic bond between him and these ETs. Also interesting is he says that this headache developed instantly and grew stronger the longer this craft was in view. Such an amazing case, considering it lasted less than a minute long. Also very interesting is the synchronicity of him finding a fairly large meteorite just a month or two after the encounter directly below where this UFO hovered. Could be pure coincidence, but I don't know. Maybe that's why the UFO was there. I haven't heard of anything like that, but who knows? It's just an interesting detail that makes you wonder. All right, let's move on to the next case, which I call Something Strange Happened. This is another case that hasn't really gotten a whole lot of attention, but is certainly worthy of it. It occurred on July 20, 1968 in Lake Karnajarv, Estonia, actually on the shore of the lake. I like this case for a number of reasons. It's got multiple witnesses, a UFO lands, there's landing traces, and of course a humanoid. In fact, what appears to be a female humanoid. So a really interesting case. This case comes from researcher Yuri Lina and was published in the Flying Saucer Review, volume 24, number 1. The witnesses are 3 14-year-old girls, all anonymous. They had heard of UFOs because at that time accounts were often appearing in the newspapers and magazines, and the girls were excited about it. They talked about their desire to have a UFO encounter someday. And this actually happened when they were staying at the Vesky Sports Camp located on the shores of Lake Karnajarv near the city of Otepa in northern Estonia. It was on the evening of July 20, 1968, sometime between midnight and 1 a.m., when one of the girls, I'll call her Rebecca, that's a pseudonym, says, quote, "Something strange happened." And I'll just quote her directly. And she says, "We were sitting at a wooden table behind the house, our usual dining place. I remember it was an unusually silent and beautiful moonlit night. Suddenly, we noticed a bright star moving at high speed in the sky. Soon it joined a cigar-shaped object that had suddenly appeared. In a short time it was gone, out of sight. As it was already late, we decided to go to bed. It is interesting to add that we felt a strange, threatening fear all the time. It was as if we anticipated some curious event. The feeling paralyzed us, and we felt it even in the room. The large cigar in the air added to the fear." The sighting alone was exciting enough, but the strange events had only just begun. As Rebecca says, "When I began to undress, the room was suddenly filled with light. My girlfriend shouted, 'Look! What's that?' I turned towards the window, and I saw a big bright object at a distance of about 50 meters. I thought it was like a bus. It was surrounded by a reddish, orange, and yellow beams, as of a searchlight. We were dazzled by the light, but soon it went out, and only a dark glowing nebula remained in view. It began to radiate blue-green light. We could also see a blue-green stripe around the object, which seemed to diminish in size. It reminded us a bit of a disk. This bluish light was very mysterious. It illuminated the surrounding woods and filled us with fear. The object was in our field of view for about 5 minutes. Then we heard a gentle buzz, and it was gone. We could not see it take off. It disappeared behind the bushes at the side of the country road. Now, when they viewed this thing, the object appeared to be landed on the ground, an estimated 450 feet away from the witnesses. And the encounter now seemed to be over, but actually the most exciting part was yet to come, starting when Rebecca had a very strange and overwhelming impulse. As Rebecca says, again I quote, "Now I felt an urgent need to go outside, although I felt stiff when watching the object. When I reached the corner of the house, I saw a small human-shaped figure which looked like a woman. This figure was standing in the place where the object had been, and it could have been about 140, 150 centimeters tall. This is 4.5 to 5 feet. And as she says, it had what seemed like a shining silver ribbon across its breast. The creature vanished suddenly into the air. I could see it for a very short time only, then I went back to my room. Now the girls spent a restless night, as you can imagine, and when morning arrived, there were several interesting discoveries made. Rebecca and the other 2 witnesses shared their experience with their friends, but to their disappointment, they were not taken seriously and were actually advised by their friends not to talk about it. They soon learned, however, that there were other witnesses. The kitchen workers said that they had been rowing on the lake around midnight at the same time of this encounter when they heard a very loud noise very close to the lake, which was apparently unusual and unexplained. This really surprised the witnesses because they did not remember hearing any noise. But even more interesting was that they went to the area and discovered what appeared to be landing traces. As Rebecca says, "In the place where the object had been, the ground seemed burned, as if a load of lime had eaten into the grass. The burned place was vaguely circular, with a diameter of about 2 meters. It was strange. In the region of 30 meters up the road, there were most peculiar prints in the soil, as if the object had jumped along the road." Now, researcher Juri Lina not only interviewed Rebecca, he spoke with her mother, who confirmed that Rebecca and her friends had told her about the incident. But although there were a lot of other people at the Vesca Sports Club, nobody else reported seeing anything strange. An amazing case by any account, and came very close to not being documented, as I think the vast majority of cases do. People are discouraged from talking about it. Many of them keep silent for years. Most often, cases are not immediately researched, so a lot of the evidence that would support it gets lost, such as the landing traces in this case, which people reported, but unfortunately investigators did not get to examine them directly. But so interesting and I think important. It's an unusual case. To me, the most interesting aspect to it is how the witnesses reported this Oz effect that we hear so often about, this eerie silence, and also the feeling that something else was going to happen, which makes me wonder if perhaps there was some sort of telepathic communication going on with the main witness, something that made her look outside and saw this female humanoid. Really interesting and so unusual. But if you think that's unusual, just wait. This next case is off the charts strange. I call this one Glowing Orange Humanoids. This took place on August 24, 1970 in Olmsted Falls, Ohio, right in the middle of the suburbs. During daytime, multiple witnesses saw these very strange glowing orange humanoids, who appeared to be largely human but clearly weren't, and were dressed so strange. I can't say I've ever heard anything quite like this, but I think we have to take it seriously because there are quite a few witnesses and apparent landing traces and all kinds of activity going on in this area at that time. This case comes from Ohio MUFON and was first publicized at the 1971 National UFO Conference in Cleveland, Ohio, and was later published by longtime researcher Rick Hilberg. The main witness is Raymond L. His last name was withheld at his request. It was 6:35 in the morning on August 24, 1970, as Raymond and two others had just reached the bus stop located at the intersection of Lindbergh and West Road in Olmsted Falls, Ohio. You can see the location here, and this is when all three of them noticed something none of them had ever seen before. As Raymond says, "We saw two strange figures approaching us on the road which crossed our bus route. The two figures were dressed in orange suits from head to foot. They were 5 feet tall, the headdresses were conical, only their faces were uncovered, and their skin was yellowish." He said these beings appeared to be carrying a disc-like object above their heads, though Raymond does not describe how big this object was. But as they watched, these beings walked about 50 feet up to a small house and then walked side by side away to a railway crossing about 600 feet from the corner where the witnesses were located. The beings then stopped by the railway. A car driving by on a road stopped right in front of them. The passengers apparently looked at this strange being for a period of about 10 seconds, then sped quickly away. The figures then walked a short distance towards the witnesses, but at this point the bus arrived. Raymond and the others climbed on board. Raymond says that as they boarded the bus, one of the beings extended his arm upwards. Raymond could now see that this being appeared to be wearing a cape, and he had the impulse to get off the bus and approach these figures, but as he says, he was, quote, unsure of the consequences. So that was the extent of the encounter, but later that night, he went to the area where the beings had first appeared and found that the high grass in the field was, quote, quite disturbed, twisted, and matted, and there were two fresh paths going to this spot. Now, a few days later, he did find another witness to this event. As Raymond says, "I talked with the children who lived in the house which the figures approached. A girl, about 9 years of age, said that at about 9 o'clock that morning, she saw an object like a huge bubble come down from the sky to that very same place I found. She said two figures were waiting there. When the vehicle landed, they entered. It then rose quickly and disappeared." Now, researcher Rick Hilberg has since tried to locate other witnesses, but has not been successful. Interestingly, this encounter occurred only a few blocks from his house. He did find a case in that same area that occurred some 3 years later on October 1st, 1973. It was 3:30 a.m. A lady by the name of Barbara Markart was driving in her car when she saw a glowing green sphere move over her vehicle and then land in a field, again in this area of Olmsted. She rushed home and called the police. And as police chief Richard Maziel says, "We couldn't locate anything back there, but it's a large field. Several people did hear some strange, eerie noises. They have never heard anything like it before. It did upset the animals. One horse even ran off." Now it turned out that several other witnesses had also seen this green sphere, and all the witnesses agreed that it was, quote, "real bright." Now 3 years before Raymond's encounter with these humanoids, on November 11, 1967, a gentleman by the name of Mr. Dort of the FAA in North Olmsted actually told Project Blue Book authorities that their office had picked up an unidentified, quote, "primary target" in an area where there ordinarily was no air traffic. They could see on their scopes that it was moving at about 50 miles per hour. It was also tracked by radar in Buffalo. As far as they know, nobody observed this object visually. They really tried to explain this away as a balloon. However, all attempts to locate any balloon in that area yielded no results. Such an amazing case. Really unusual because there's multiple witnesses seeing humanoids quite close up during the day. There's landing traces. That other case, having radar confirmation, is certainly interesting. Can't say it's directly connected to this one, but clearly this area, Olmsted, Ohio, has quite a bit of activity. Such an unusual case. Now, let's move to the next one, which is particularly poignant. Really touched me. I mean, this kid had such an amazing encounter with apparent grays in his bedroom at night. And you can tell from his testimony how deeply it affected him. I call this one Eyes Like Black Mirrors. This occurred one evening in July of 1988 in the small town of Linden, California. But wow, the witness's description of these ETs is just so vivid. Eyes like black mirrors. That really gives you an idea of what it's like to look into the eyes of a gray ET. Most often people are very much impressed by the entity's eyes. There's something about them that I think is particularly hypnotizing, and they sort of look through a witness, is how many people put it. But I think you'll find this case really fascinating. This case, reported to MUFON, has not, as far as I know, been officially investigated, so it's largely anecdotal. But it does involve a clearly sincere first-hand testimony from the witness himself. He actually kept it secret for almost 40 years. As he says, "I have shared this story with 2 people, only because I don't know what to make of it." The witness, I call him Ethan, that is a pseudonym, was 7 or 8 years old at the time of his encounter. It was around July in 1988. He had gone to visit his brother in Linden, California, and one evening in the middle of the night, the sound of the dog barking outside woke him up. As he woke up, he saw bright flashing lights through the bedroom window. He first thought it might be a police car, but going to the window to look outside, he was shocked at what he saw. Says Ethan, "I saw a cylinder-shaped object in the front yard, with multicolored lights spinning around the top in a circle. It was hovering close to the ground, 10 feet off the ground. I remember a strange buzzing noise." Now Ethan's brother was sleeping in the same room, but did not wake up. And per Ethan, he noticed a weird effect. Time seemed to move at a very slow pace, quote, "almost like everything stopped." But he could still move, and this is when he noticed a blindingly bright light coming down the hallway, so bright it was almost like a spotlight. Everything was so strange he wondered if he might be dreaming. But then he saw something even more shocking. And again, I'll quote him directly because he describes this in detail. Says Ethan, "What I saw I will never ever forget in my lifetime. I saw a tall, dark, skinny, almost human-shaped body, a figure come out of the room and stand by the doorway. It was not dressed. It had no clothes, no genitals. It had dark charcoal gray skin, long fingers, but it only had 2 or 3 fingers. The figure had a strangely large head, no hair, but the shape of the head was round with a point on the top. I remember the black eyes the most. like black mirrors. They were teardrop shaped, they slanted up on the right and left side, and they did not close. It didn't have a nose, just two small slits below the eyes and a small mouth. I stood there trying to figure out what I was seeing. It stared at me. I wasn't scared at the sight of the first alien. It kept tilting its head while it was looking at me. I was trying to understand what I was seeing, and I was curious as we just stared at each other for about a minute or two, about 8 feet away. I had the urge to walk towards it, but never did. Something initially was comforting to me. I cannot explain that feeling. Then I saw two more. They looked at each other. They didn't speak or make any noises at all. Now Ethan had the distinct impression that this first ET was mentally communicating to the other two that he, Ethan, was awake. At this point he was not afraid, but soon events began to escalate. As Ethan says, then they started walking towards me. At first I froze. I was so scared I panicked. All I could think to do was run. I got spooked when the other two of them came towards me, and I remember not feeling the same way about them. I felt an uncomfortableness with them. I remember feeling like time stopped or slowed in some way, and everyone around was completely oblivious to what was happening around me. So with nowhere to go, Ethan jumped into bed, pulled the covers over his head, curled up into a fetal position, and closed his eyes. He was shaking with fear and just prayed to himself that it was all just a bad dream. And that was all he remembered until he woke up the next morning. There was no evidence that anything unusual had occurred. Nobody else reported anything strange, and he really wondered about what happened. This was a group home for boys. At the time of the encounter, the group mother was sick with tumors in her body and would later pass away from her condition. Ethan wondered if perhaps her illness was a factor in this visitation, if perhaps the ETs had come for her for some reason, or as he says, if they were there to help her. This experience, as you can imagine, affected him profoundly. As he says, I questioned myself if it was just a dream, but I can remember everything. The feeling, the lights, the slow movements, the encounter, the fear. I do not have any evidence. Also another reason for not really discussing it with anyone, because I thought people would accuse me of making it up. There you go. Another case that very nearly went unrecorded because this witness thought that nobody would believe him. Thankfully, he did find the courage and strength to come forward. Kudos to any witness who does this, because again, I keep saying this, but it bears repeating. Most people don't report it in any official capacity. Such an amazing case. And so is this next one, which is very similar but equally poignant. This involves a young girl, actually, who had a bedroom visitation by gray ETs. I call this one, "We Are Your Sisters." It's a direct quote from the Greys themselves. This occurred one late summer evening in 1990 in Langhorne, Pennsylvania. This witness describes her encounter with such vivid detail, such an honest and sincere account. It's enough to bring tears to your eyes. Really, obviously an intelligent witness, and I think you'll find this case to be particularly interesting. What I am about to disclose is going to sound absolutely insane. So writes Natalie, that's a pseudonym, regarding this encounter that occurred to her when she was only 6 years old. It was early August in 1990. It was a blazing hot night, which necessitated leaving her bedroom window open so she could sleep. And sometime in the middle of the night, Natalie woke up to very bright lights coming from outside her open window. As she says, it was as if someone turned on a bunch of stadium lights at the same time. For Natalie, these bright lights were accompanied by a low, buzzing vibration. She leaned over the side of her bed to get a better look outside and immediately felt, quote, this pulsating energy, like static electricity. She said the lights were too bright to stare at, and squinting at them didn't help. At this point she was more curious than afraid, and immediately wondered why her parents hadn't woken up. Their bedroom window faced the same direction, so they should have woken up. Still trying to peer outside, she noticed something or someone moving in front of the lights, casting a long shadow across the lawn. Now this did scare her, and she hid under the blanket and closed her eyes, hoping this was all just a dream. She tried to relax. 1 or 2 long minutes passed, and finally she opened her eyes, and peering through the blanket, she could see that the lights had dimmed somewhat. So she's thinking perhaps it's morning, this is all just a dream, but still wondering, she turned to her side, made a little peephole through the blanket and looked to the window, and to her intense fear, there was a tall, dark, shadowy figure standing directly outside of the window and looking in. Now thoroughly panicked, she tossed off her covers, backed up as far as she could to the side of the wall and the headboard of her bed. She was sitting upright with her feet out in front of her and her arms at her side, at which moment, she says, she was immediately paralyzed by that same strong static electric energy that she had felt earlier. And following this, she felt, as she says, quote, a wave of calm. Now, unable to move, unable to cry out, she could only sit there and watch as this figure climbed through the open window and into her room. She said it moved in a strange, floating, almost fluid way. Immediately another figure followed, moving in that same strange manner, and she could now see that they were alien-looking humanoids, a head, torso, arms and legs, and she describes them in great detail. As she says, they were gray, with a glossy look to their skin, almost silvery. Everything about them was long and slim, except their heads. Their eyes were shiny, oversized, and black, similar to a yellow jacket or a fly. I could see the lights coming from outside reflecting on them, but they were expressionless. They did not blink. Their noses were undefined, just 2 small nostril holes with a little flap of skin over the sides, similar to a bird's nair. Their mouths were thin lines. They seemed non-functional, and like their eyes, their mouths remained motionless. One feature that really impressed her was how thin their necks were, so thin that it seemed impossible to her that they could support these huge heads. Now, as Natalie says, they stood there for a moment looking at me. Then they looked at each other, almost like they were confirming something. When they turned back to me, they spoke. Their mouths weren't moving, but I could hear the words they were saying in my head. I later learned that this is telepathy. They spoke in unison, in an almost monotone voice, but one of them had a slightly slower cadence, so it sounded almost like an echo. Now the message they said really surprised her. They said, quote, do not be afraid. We are not here to hurt you. We are your sisters. Now one of the beings remained in front of the window beside her bed, while the other moved to the front of her bed. She could see that the second one was holding 2 unusual-looking tools, one similar to a reflex hammer used by doctors to test human reflexes, but the other was somewhat similar to a pulse oximeter, but as she says, quote, different than anything I've ever seen in my life. They then proceeded to conduct what Natalie believes to be some kind of physical examination. They looked at her arms, they seemed to tickle her armpits, they looked at her legs, at the soles of her feet, they felt behind her ears. She saw that their fingers were very much similar to ours, only much longer, and she could in fact feel some warmth coming from them. Now Natalie says, their expressions never changed, but I sensed they were communicating. I just couldn't hear it. They seemed satisfied with either their task or their findings. I'm not sure. The one at the foot of the bed gave the smallest nod to the other, and they left the same way they came in. I was conscious of them leaving, but I was more focused on being unable to move. Now, Natalie says that as soon as the beings exited, the lights outside became very bright and then flashed off. The buzzing sound immediately stopped. The paralysis lifted as if a switch had been flipped, and Natalie now saw that it was morning. As she says, I was still in the upright position I had been paralyzed in, and it had been the middle of the night just a second before. So this was very confusing to her. She got out of bed, and without telling her mom what happened, asked if her sisters had come in and tickled her in the middle of the night, and their mother's reply was predictable, where did you come up with something like that? So Natalie realized that she was the only one who had experienced anything strange that night. Following that encounter, she refused to go to bed unless the window was closed and her blanket covered her body, despite how hot it was outside. This is a condition which persists to this day. A few years later, she was watching TV with her sister when an illustration of a gray alien appeared on the screen. Natalie became instantly filled with dread because the gray alien on the TV screen was an exact match to the two humanoid figures she had seen in her room years earlier. So gone was any possible explanation that she might have dreamed up the whole thing, and it really filled her with an anxiety that became chronic. Once as a preteen, she did try sharing the experience with her friends, who just laughed at her, called her weird, crazy, and as she says, other hurtful things. As Natalie says, I never openly spoke about it again for fear of being ridiculed and not believed. She grew up, got married, and the ETs never returned. But after a few years of marriage, the subject of UFOs came up, and Natalie tearfully spilled out her experience to her husband. He listened and asked her many questions, and after she explained it all, said that he believed her. They ended up having 5 children. 35 years after the encounter in 2024, Natalie and her husband were watching the congressional hearings on the subject of UFOs, and Natalie decided to report her case officially. As she says, I know I have waited 35 years to say something, but this encounter has been burned into my mind, and I fear I will never forget it. I have been struggling with an overwhelming sense that I need to talk about my encounter with someone qualified. Due to my age at the time, I didn't have the vocabulary or the cognition to fully grasp what happened. I don't want anyone reading this to think that my description is exaggerated or untrue because I am able to explain it more coherently at age 40 than at age 6. I am not looking for any kind of publicity from this. In fact, I would prefer to remain anonymous. I am willing to take a lie detector test or whatever is deemed necessary to validate my claim, but it's time to talk about it with someone who has the experience in the field, because I still have way too many questions that I can't answer for myself. Such a profound encounter. I'm really glad she did come forward. She told her husband, who was very supportive. Kudos to him. This is the kind of experience that it can be very stressful for the family unit. And people will even keep their encounter secret from their own siblings, their best friends, even their spouse. But thankfully he was supportive, totally believed her, and together they worked through this encounter. So yeah, so poignant, so amazing, and just really detailed. Now, let's move to the last and final case in this compilation. I call this one the Childlike ETs. This one occurred on December 12, 1997 in a little town near Šibenik, Croatia. The town is called, and I'm going to butcher this name, I'm so sorry, it's called Krveležvo. I tried. At any rate, I did cover this case before in a previous episode, but it was so short. One of you lovely viewers out there was able to find more information for me, which really clarified some details that were actually misreported in most of the accounts in this case, and provided a really comprehensive description of what actually happened, including photographs of the location and more. So yeah, that's why I'm presenting it again, because the information that this gentleman learned directly from the ETs is super fascinating. A really interesting encounter. He didn't have a lot of fear, so I think he was able to observe these ETs much more lucidly than perhaps a lot of other witnesses who do have fear. But I am certain you'll find this case really interesting. The witness in this case is Yakov Rancik, a metal worker who, after retiring at age 65, decided to move with his wife to a farm in the small village of Sirlevo. This is outside of Šibenik, Croatia. It was around noon on December 12, 1997. Janko was tending to his garden and his herd of sheep in the meadows next to his home when he suddenly heard a loud buzzing noise. much like he says, quote, a refrigerator buzzing. It was coming from behind him, and when it continued, he became curious about it, decided to leave his herd and go investigate the source of this sound, and about 150 feet away at the far end of this meadow, he found what was making this noise. As he says, I followed the noise, and when I got there, I saw some small beings, like children, around some kind of aircraft, which looked to me like a turned plate, shiny gray in color, approximately 4 meters in diameter. The beings were maybe 1.4 meters tall, that's about 4.5 feet, very skinny, longer arms, much bigger heads and eyes than humans, very, very small nose and mouth, and their skin was gray. They were dressed in gray overalls with some small caps on their heads. They were doing something around that craft like they were fixing something. They looked at me, but they kept doing their job. So Yanko was amazed and intrigued. He could see that this craft was not actually landed on the ground itself, but was hovering about 1 meter or 3 feet above the ground, and there was a small stairway-like structure leading to the ground. And he was curious, so he began to ask them questions. His first question was, "What are you doing?" One of the ETs replied, speaking a kind of broken Croatian, but with a strange accent that reminded him of Russian, that they had some problems with their aircraft and they decided to land to fix it. Now when this being spoke, Yakov noticed that the ET's mouth remained closed when he spoke, and ultimately researchers concluded that the communication was telepathic. Then Yakov asked them about God, and they provided a puzzling answer. As Yakov says, they have 2 gods, one on the south, one on the North Pole. I don't know what that means. Perhaps this is a misunderstanding. At any rate, he next asked them if they were hungry. And they said they don't eat food from here. As Yakov says, the being showed me 1 pill in his hand and said it is enough for them for the whole day. Now Yakov says he had no previous interest in UFOs, had never read about them. He had heard about them from television, so he understood what he was experiencing. He says he had no fear of the ETs, they seemed very friendly, so he just continued to watch. As he says, I continued to watch them. Then I noticed through the window 1 shadow inside the aircraft. It was walking inside and did not come out, so I could not see what it looked like. All this took about 3 to 4 minutes. They told me not to speak about the encounter for 7 days, and boarded the aircraft and smoothly flew off, then disappeared into the clouds. Now, despite the ET's request for him to remain silent for a week, this experience was so strange that he couldn't do it. As he says, I tried not to think about that, but just could not. Later on, I told my wife what had happened. She told my family in the city, and somehow the word spread to some local newspaper, and they sent a journalist. Now, to his disappointment, this encounter caused all kinds of publicity and attention. Soon researchers showed up and interviewed him. They tested the landing site for radiation, which came out negative. Yakov says that some of the newspaper accounts for his story were sensationalized and inaccurate. They talked about how he had offered them food, which they took. He said that that did not happen. He did not offer the ETs any food, nor did they take any food from him. So that's the UFO landing in humanoids seen in Croatia. How interesting is it that the ETs requested he not talk about his encounter for 1 week? I don't blame him for talking about it immediately to his spouse, but her running and telling his family right away, it's kind of amusing, but definitely led to this case getting some publicity and being fully investigated. So ultimately, I think that is beneficial. People deserve to know the truth about what's going on. This cover-up that is worldwide, carefully orchestrated, heavily funded, is really nefarious. I don't think it's serving humanity's best purposes by any means. The truth is going to come out sooner or later. I mean, you can distort it, you can hide it, you can lie about it, but you can never destroy it. Truth is truth, and it's eternal. So that, I think, is why sooner or later The cover-up is just going to collapse under the weight of its own lies. You can't hide the sky. I've said it for years. The truth is going to come out one way or another, and that's exactly what we're seeing. These 10 cases are just the tip of the iceberg, as you know. I've covered well over, I think, 2,000 humanoid cases on this channel alone, and I'm still just skimming the surface here. This is how common these kinds of encounters are. It's amazing to me, all over the world. So yeah, one of the most important subjects facing humanity today, in my opinion. It's time that all humanity knows the truth about this and that this cover-up ends. It's one of the main reasons I do this research. So, thank you again, you guys. It's because of you I do this show and work so hard to get this information out. I know a lot of you out there are having encounters, and there's just not a lot of places you can go for trustworthy information, objectively reported. That's what I'm trying so hard to do for you. So yeah, thank you again. I hope you've enjoyed this episode, perhaps learned something. And until next time, keep asking those hard questions, keep searching for the truth. Most important of all, keep having fun. I will see you next Friday. Bye for now.